notes. Am I talking into here? Yes. Okay. Kia ora koutou. Ko Jayne Ihaka tōku ingoa. I work at ANZ, and my job there is looking after our digital assistant, Jamie. So this is Jamie. I'm not going to attempt a live demo because that's asking for a disaster, but if you want to go and try her out, she's on our website, anz.co.nz. And Jamie's there to have a conversation with customers and just answer any general questions they have about banking with ANZ. So I use RStudio most days in my job. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the tools I use to understand a bit better what customers are talking to Jamie about. So you can understand how R is applicable in a commercial setting and some of the pros and cons of those approaches for our particular use case. So before I jump into that, quickly explain what's going on inside Jamie's brain when you have a conversation with her. So in the industry, they call this conversational AI. Underneath it's really just a gigantic classification model, which takes the things you say and then tries to understand the intent behind that thing you're saying. So we use a vendor product to do this, but some companies create their own from open source libraries. So what we do is take what the customer says, the user request, we sometimes call that an utterance, and we define a certain intent that is behind that. We train it with loads and loads of different phrases, so we have to imagine all the different ways that you might ask that same question. We test it out, and then hopefully it can match your question to an intent and then trigger the response that Jamie says back to you. So you do this over and over again, and it becomes a conversation. We also extract some bits of information called entities, and we use something called context to drive the next step in the conversation. So when customers are having these conversations all the time, we accumulate a huge amount of data, and as Jackie said, sometimes the problem is, what do we do with it all? So what I'm really trying to understand as a product manager is what are customers asking Jamie about, so that we can better prioritize what we need to train her on and improve her performance with. The next thing is, how successful are these conversations? Are we actually being helpful? Is it worth spending all this money on? And how are we improving over time? And then lastly, if there's things that are going wrong, how can we pinpoint those areas and focus on what we need to fix to make her better? So firstly, what are users asking about? So the quick and dirty way of figuring out what people are asking is just to look at those intents that are being hit. So let's say we've defined an intent for when someone asks, oh, I'm having trouble logging into internet banking. So we've got an intent for that. We can see how it's tracking over time, and we can see when there are big spikes. So just a quick ggplot will show you that in November, we had a big spike in that when there was an internet banking outage. So it's quite useful for just seeing how things are going over time. But the problem with this, just looking at the intents, is that it relies on those questions that we're already expecting and that we've already trained our model on. It doesn't really show you new emerging topics that customers might be asking about that we haven't even thought of yet. So that's where some more exciting text mining tools come in. But to do that, there's a lot of pre-processing that's involved to actually make it useful. So this will depend on the type of use case that you're working with, but for us, one of the first things I need to do is strip out everything that's not something that a customer has said. So we have a few like automated requests and tests and things that we need to get rid of. We strip out all the weird characters, uppercase, numbers, get rid of contractions like wasn't needs to become was not. Then I do something called stop words, and there's a great package for this, which just takes out all those little meaningless words like the, at, in, which just really add noise that we don't really care about. Then stemming and lemmatizing, which are sort of similar concepts, but really what you're trying to do there is take every word down to its root. So opening, opened, opens, really it's all just open, so we replace it with one thing. And then finally, you can also group some words depending on what you're interested in seeing. So we see a lot of customers who might say, oh, I'm in Singapore and my card's blocked. Well, I'm interested in seeing how many customers are overseas and have a certain issue. I don't actually care that much about the individual countries. I'm more interested in what are the people overseas and who are the people talking about particular places in New Zealand. So that's one example that's kind of particular to what you're trying to find out. So there's some great R packages for that, which you'll see there, and I've got them throughout the slides. Once we've done all that, how can we compare what people are saying across different categories? So one example is that we have customers that can interact with Jayme in either a voice interface or a chat interface. So you can talk to Jayme or you can just type. And I was interested in seeing what are some of the different ways that people speak to her in those two different modes. So using all those words that we've just cleaned up, what are the most common ones in both groups? Well, gee whiz, look, they're talking about accounts and money, which is no surprise because we're a bank, so that's not particularly enlightening. So another method that's a bit more useful for comparing groups like that is something called TD-IDF. And again, there's a great R package that does this for you. And what that does is looks at words that are really common in a particular group or document, whatever you want to call it, and how rare they are in the other group. So that really starts to bring out what are some of the things that are really unique that customers are saying in that particular category. So one thing that's quite interesting that came out from doing this is when people are using a voice interface, they say stuff like alarm, timer, wake, because that's what people are used to when they're talking to Siri or Alexa. They go, oh, it's a voice interface. Set an alarm for 6 o'clock. So Jayme can't do that for you, but you know, people try. So that's kind of interesting to surface some of those things that people are doing. The downside, of course, is it doesn't really give you much context, so you don't get useful phrases or the order of words or some of the nuance around it. Like, why is water there? I don't know, what are people saying about water? So that's where keyword extraction comes in. So I've used this method called rake, and what that does is it looks at common words or groups of words that commonly occur closely together. So that gives us much more useful keywords. So people are talking about a recent transaction they just did, travel insurance, how do I close an account? And that gives us much more useful information about what kinds of questions and topics are emerging. So one upside of this is it's completely unsupervised, so we don't have to spend time trying to imagine, oh, what are all the things we might like to look for and tagging a bunch of information, because let's be honest, we spend enough time training Jayme without having to train models to find out more about Jayme. So this is really good at just surfacing some of those things that are going on that you might not have even thought about yet. Another one that's more useful for looking at the overall conversation rather than just individual keywords is topic modeling. So I'm not going to try and pronounce this, but LDA is a really common one for doing this. And what that does is it creates topics which are basically a whole collection of words, and then your documents, which are in this case conversations, can belong to a number of those different topics. And that's really useful because not all conversations are categorized as a single topic. In real life, when we're talking to someone, we can talk about lots of different topics in a single conversation, and this model reflects that really well, so that's quite useful. And again, it's unsupervised, so things come up to the surface that we just haven't even considered, and we don't need to go and train a model in advance. So you can see topic 1 is about sending money overseas. Topic 7 is people just randomly playing, saying, tell me a joke, what's your favorite color, what are you doing for Christmas, what's your favorite song, that kind of thing. So that gives us a starting point to say, oh, okay, lots of people are interested in this particular area, say home loans. Maybe we need to do some more work on that. Let's filter out those conversations by that topic, see what specific questions they're answering, and then focus our efforts on that area. Another way, once you've identified a particular topic, if you want to track that, is to do what we call an elegant failure. So that's where we've got a topic that we haven't really trained Jayme on yet, we haven't taken the time to go through all the individual questions, but we just want to kind of capture it and see how it goes over time. So you can just create a generic intent with a response like, oh, sorry, I'm still learning about that, I can't help you just yet. And what that does is, firstly, it creates a slightly better customer experience rather than just a generic fallback, because at least it feels like she's kind of understood you, even if she can't help. And then what it means is that you can follow how that goes over time with just all the random questions about that topic pointing to a specific intent. And then you can see, is it worth delving into this a bit deeper and creating some content about that area. So, for example, Jamie is really made for helping with your personal accounts at the moment, but maybe in the future will help with business banking. We've got a generic fallback that captures all those random questions about business, and we look at that over time and see how it goes. Right, so next thing, how successful are the conversations? This is really tricky to do, but there's a range of measures you can look at and combine. So the most obvious one is just ask the user. So we have a star rating. Some people use customer satisfaction or net promoter score. And that's quite good for highlighting what are the really good conversations and what are the really bad ones. But the limitation is it doesn't really take into account the actual performance of the conversation. It's influenced by all these other factors that could be going on that made that customer really happy or sad. Also, not everyone wants to fill out a survey after they've had a chat, so the sample size is pretty small. But it's good for seeing roughly how we're going. Confidence scores, if you're using any kind of conversational platform, normally each intent will spit out some kind of confidence score, and you can use that to see how those individual questions are performing and if you need to do some more training. But again, that doesn't really tell you how good the overall conversation is. Sentiment analysis, tried it. I don't think it's particularly useful at this point. Doesn't really take into account the nuances of Kiwi sarcasm and things like yeah, nah. And also, customers might be coming to us, really unhappy because they've just lost their card in a foreign country, and that's going to be bad sentiment, but Jamie might actually be really helpful. One that I particularly like is to define certain points in a conversational pathway as successful. So if you said, oh, I'm locked out of internet banking, and Jamie goes, let's try some password troubleshooting. Have you turned off your caps lock? Yep, okay, I'll do that now. Did that work? Yes, great. That point in the conversation we can define as the customer got to some sort of resolution, so every time that node gets hit, we'll say, tick, that's a successful conversation. So those are quite useful, but again, it relies on the fact that all those intents are actually accurate. If she's completely misunderstood you that whole time, then tracking how you get to that point is not going to be very useful. The most useful I've found, which is not very high tech, but just getting a human to read it. So by taking a few minutes every day just to have a look at some of the transcripts, a human can tell straight away whether that was a good conversation or a bad one. And it also just gives you a really good feel for what are some of the gaps that we need to focus on. Right, so what can we do to make it better? My favourite way to try and understand where some of these conversations are going wrong is by making it into a network. So I really love graphs and networks, so I was really excited when I found some way I could kind of use it for work. Yeah, sorry, that sounds really nerdy. If you think of each node in a conversation each intent in a conversation as a node, and then all the things that customers say to jump between each step in a conversation as the edges or the links, then you can make a network out of all the most common conversational pathways. And so that way you can see what are the patterns that are starting to form. Like, people always ask about this thing and then they ask about this other thing. Well, maybe we should design for that particular conversation better. Or people keep going around in circles and just looping back to the same point here. Maybe we need to make that a bit clearer so they don't just keep hitting the same thing. So there's great R packages for that. Personally, I find tools like Gephi or even D3 are really great for visualizing those and using them in a more interactive way, so you can kind of zoom in and see, oh, what's this intent? Right. So, in summary, R is really great for exploring conversational data and trying to extract some insights as to what's going on in all these mountains of conversations. But there's a lot of manual work involved in pre-processing, and it's important to get that right and make sure that you do it in a way that suits the use case you're working with. Measuring success is hard, mainly because if the machine could accurately identify what a good conversation looks like, then surely the machine could just create a good conversation in the first place and I'd be out of a job. So it really requires a whole range of measures. And finally, analytics is really useful, but it still needs a human to validate what you're seeing and to dig a bit deeper to understand what's really going on. So I'll stop there and take some questions.
Thank you, Jayne. We do have time for some questions, so
Sure.
you can pick some.
Great. This is the question I get every time. Okay, what was the process behind Jamie's design, i.e. young and female, and does ANZ have responsibility not to bow to stereotyping workers in customer service roles? Yep, so I absolutely agree that this is a huge issue. So the real story is that when we first started working with Soul Machines, the company that created Jamie, she was actually modelled off a real human who was an engineer there. And that was kind of the stock standard avatar at the time when they were doing this project, and so that's kind of what we went with. But looking around now, it's pretty clear that the vast majority of digital assistants are all young, female, ethnically ambiguous, and that's not really helpful. There are companies that say, oh, we did customer research and people prefer to speak to a woman about this stuff. But I suspect that's just because of their existing biases about women in customer service roles. And so by having all the digital assistants in the world being female, we're really not helping that problem. It's reinforcing those stereotypes even more of women as being subservient and basically there to do as you tell them. So I totally agree that's an issue. And I think, you know, looking back, if we were starting this project again today, I'd be thinking more about how do we build something that's going to help that problem and not make it worse. So I hope that answers your question. Do people treat chatbots worse than real people? Yes, particularly because ours is totally anonymous. So you'd see a lot of abuse come through. And I think the fact that Jamie's represented as a woman is not great either, because you see a lot of gendered abuse, and that's why the whole gender issue I just talked about is so important. One more. How does the work you do connect to other ANZ teams? So, yeah, one thing that we didn't really realise initially was that there's huge value in just understanding the customer experience a bit better through these transcripts. So, although Jamie is primarily there to help people solve problems and provide customer service, if there's something going wrong with a product, or maybe there's like some process that's really crap that customers don't understand or don't like, you really start to see that come through in the conversations, because people are you know, really honest and will tell you what's wrong in quite an unfiltered way. So there's value in collating some of that stuff and then delivering it back to the right person, whether it's a product manager or someone internally, and say, look, this is what customers are saying. Here's like word for word what's going wrong. Why don't you do something about it? So yeah, that's something we didn't anticipate. That's been really valuable.
Thank you.